Welcome everybody to Oregon State University's Permaculture Design Pro. This is the fall and winter 2022 class, and this is our very first office hour. So welcome to everybody on the call today, and welcome to everybody who's taking a look at this after the fact. Such a pleasure to have everybody here. I'll just get everybody to mute yourself as you come on, and every once in a while, if people aren't muted, I'll just mute everybody with the click of a button. So what we're going to do today is we're going to overview what these office hours are all about. We'll talk a little bit about some of the initial announcements about the course, and any question you have whatsoever. In the chat bar, you'll see that we've already had that link put in, but I'll do it again, and just make sure to put your link into, or your question into the question document. So I'm going to showcase that now so everyone can see what that looks like. So this is our question document for our class. And you'll see at the top, we have our login information, including our link and the passcode. We also have a document of previous office hours. So we've been running these office hours now for 5 different student offerings, including this one thus far. So if you take a look at some of the shorthand conversations here, Institute's Earthwork Soil, Introduction to iPad Design Apps, Microclimate Zones, you may have an interest or a question about one of these different elements. And so you can click on these office hours from previous students. We had a student who was down in Botswana who was dealing with snakes and voles. So we had a nice conversation about that. But you can see that generally we have the same questions over and over. So if you do want to take that advantage and go take a look at that, you absolutely can. And in terms of our office hours, if you're going to put a question into our document, you'll put in your name, where you're from, and then a link to your portfolio if your question is specific to your design site. This allows me and everybody else in the class to quickly go to your portfolio, to take a look at it, and to answer your question. You'll get this a lot in the tutorials as well as my feedback. I really find that for clients, bolding the elements of a specific block of text that are important to them is really important. And it really helps them to get to the heart of what they're talking about. So I talk about this a lot, and a number of students and clients have picked it up, so feel free to. So basically it's a question from Richard was, I heard you mention hugelkultur. I watched a few videos. I read hard words are better than soft words. I have a lot of ponderosa pine. So really just whatever question that comes up, great to put in here, especially if you can't make the office hours, because I will still address it if there's enough information, and you can come back and take a look at it. This is a master resource list that I've been developing now for close to 14 years. It includes resources and books about pretty much everything, be it from seed saving, propagation, aquaculture, compost, natural building, animals, heat, homesteading. So this is me just sharing a resource that I've developed over the last couple of years. Of course, you are not required to read all these books. You don't have to jump into this, but if you're keen, they're here for you. And I tend to reference quite a bit of resources as we go throughout this. These are a couple of books that have come up quite a bit in our conversations previously with different students. Sometimes it's about growing food or market gardening. Sometimes it's about mycology and fungal ID. This is a brilliant book about small earthen dams that was written by K.D. Nelson, who worked all across the African continent. So this is a brilliant book. He made it open source, so this is access to my Dropbox files for you to download. Similarly, the Quivira Coalition has an amazing erosion control guide. So if you're dealing with major erosion in, I would say, arid to semi-arid environments, this is a great book for you. Also, if you're one of those people like me, when I started off on my journey into permaculture, you didn't know a thing about plants, a thing about botany. Botany in a Day by Thomas Elpelt is one of the premier books that help you start to understand IDs and what's called dichotomous keys, which will help you to understand how to ID the books you're looking for, the plants you're looking for. David Polster is a great mentor and colleague, and we'll talk probably a bit about this, about a concept called live staking, where you take living plants, you cut them and you stake them into the ground and they regrow. A lot of pioneer species will do this. He has a brilliant book called the Living on the Edge book that you can purchase through his wife, and this is her email. And then every once in a while, there's a video or a conversation that comes up that we'll talk about. And so this was a recent interview I did with Natalie Topa, who works all across Africa, is currently in the Sudan. She works a lot with displaced people, either from climate change or war or refugees. And her work is phenomenal. So if you're interested in that type of work or in full watershed restoration, her and Jeff Lawton's son, Daniel Lawton, went to this incredible mountain community, started at the top of the mountain and basically reworked the entire mountain to be an incredible array of water harvesting process. So that's an introduction to our document. And so I've got a couple of announcements I'm going to go through. Every once in a while, I'll go back to the chat and just see if there's a pertinent question. And looks like Galaxy Tab A is actually Kendra. So, well, hey, Kendra, thanks for letting us know that. So first and foremost, welcome. Thanks so much for being part of this course. There was a real turning point for me in my life when I got into permaculture. It became a tool in my toolbox. And it really marks a change from wanting to complain or be part of the problems that we see ecologically and sometimes economically in our planet to really starting to be part of a solution. So I'm so pleased to see you all here. One of the major reasons why I continue to be part in PDCs, this is my 62nd PDC in the last 13 years, is because of the people who are involved. And it's just a pleasure to have you all here. So one thing I really want to take note of is that this course is about progression. It's not about marks. And so for those of you that were traumatized by university or high school, know that the marks are just there to help me guide you to the right answer. So let's say the assignments out of 14, I was just marking the soil assignment in a previous course that started 3 months ago. And I notice a few things that could be improved or that are missing. I'm going to say, great. There's a couple things missing. Here's what's missing. Your mark will reflect that. If you want to resubmit, absolutely do so. And all you have to do is just click reply on your initial submission and just say, hey, Javan, I took care of those issues. Take a look, give me the link again, and I'll go in and remark it. So resubmission is not a big deal. The marks are just there to help me guide you towards the right answer, and you can always resubmit. The other thing I'll say is that dialogue is very much encouraged. So I'll ask questions of you during my feedback. I tend to give video feedback because this allows me to give a lot more feedback in a shorter amount of time, but also it allows me to draw on your portfolio. It allows me to use the tools within Zoom and draw and make suggestions. And when students ask me, well, what do you think about this? I'll take a look at your site and go, well, if this were I would think about this, this, and this. I just had a client who's in an Arizona area that is generally pretty dry, but then gets these flash floods. And they were basically asking, well, what does that look like? And how does that happen? And so I go in there and I start designing and drawing right on there to give you suggestions. So the nice thing about video feedback is it allows me to give you quite a bit of feedback, and then you get a chance to respond either in written format or in whatever way that works for you. I'm just gonna make this a little bit bigger. This is a course about thinking, not about rendering. So a lot of students in this course get hung up on making sure that their renders look perfect. And years ago, a great colleague of mine who also works with Oregon State University, Neil Bertrando, showed me his design work, and he was working entirely in PowerPoint, just circles and lines. And one of the things he said was he had an epiphany when his clients were saying, I don't want to pay for a pretty picture. I really want this in the ground. And this is a great example of how, yeah, it'd be wonderful if we could all have architect level drawings, but really the majority of the thinking happens in between our ears. And just like with cows, the majority of the work to produce that milk is chewing the cud. That happens with us in this work. We do a lot of thinking in this work and a lot of rethinking. I had a mentor years ago, Jude Hobbs, who teaches permaculture teaching, if anybody's ever interested in that. And she always had this idea that permaculture is this spiral where we go to water and then we come back to the holistic goals of a client. And then we go out to, well, what does the survey say? And then we come back to, well, what's the climate? And it moves back and forth. So really, this is a class about thinking and find the easiest way it is for you to render your designs. We've tried to make this as easy as possible using a free, very accessible program like Google Slides. But if that doesn't work for you, go back to pen and paper or start at pen and paper. That's totally fine. Working with pen and paper and transparency paper and making your layers on that is a great way to start off. And I still draw by hand. I do it digitally now. I use an iPad and a program called Morpholio Trace, as well as a program called Procreate and Concepts. But I still draw by hand because I find it's the best way to move with ideas. So don't worry about rendering. Work on your rendering skills after this course. This course is about learning about a design site and working with the permaculture toolset. So if your design site is far away and you can only visit 1 or 2 times, you'll want to review the assignments and collect your data all at once, because the best thing you can do is to be on your site as much as possible. And a few of you have already emailed me saying, hey, I'm not going to be at my site. Is that a problem? Yes. You need to choose a site that you can visit. So if that means changing your site to either something local, friends and family, or choosing a local city park or vacant lot and using it that way, that's totally fine. But you need to be able to go, you need to be able to take observational photos, you need to go and take observations, you need to go and measure distances and plot out where trees are and where services are. You need to be able to go and take soil samples. And for this class in particular, as a number of you are in the temperate zone, as we get into winter, you'll want to take a look ahead, specifically the soil assignment, and you may want to do the soil assignment first or very soon, depending on when freeze up happens in your location. So do take a look through the assignments, take a look at what's required, and you may want to take photos, soil assessments, things of that nature early on, especially taking a look at the plant identification assignment. It's very hard to identify plants when all we have are shrubs or woody materials, and of course, no leaves for any of our herbaceous material. So sometimes you'll need to guess at that if you wait too long or if you've already frozen up already. So a lot of people in this first assignment will say, my expectation is to be able to come out of this course and be able to design everything everywhere. That's not a realistic expectation. It took me between 3 and 5 years to be able to accurately design, to feel confident in my designs, and to really do good work. A PDC is a great place to start, but it's a terrible place to stop. And nobody after a PDC is going to be fully resourced unless you already came in as an architect or you already came as a landscape designer, and this is just another tool in your toolbox. You may be more or less eligible for this work after the fact. And one of the great ways of looking at this course is that if you're wanting to become a designer and do this full time, is to start to take a look at everything that's required to be a designer. Client intake, starting to assess clients if you're a good fit, doing contracting, then working through a design site, client relationships, working with mapping, GIS, working with hand-drawn maps or digital maps, actually having the know-how to take a look and assess a site for its water assets, its climatological assets, neighbors, and understanding that quotient and zones and sectors and all these things we'll learn throughout this course. But there may be some things that you're not resourced to do. So it's an important skill to look through this course as you're going through and really pinpoint where you have strengths and where you have weaknesses. And then after this course, diligently seek out how to improve upon your weaknesses and how to gain those skills. So that's an important thing to take in within this course. It's really be realistic in this process. One of the things that I used to advise when I was full-time teaching permaculture design courses is to have a notebook and to open it up onto 2 pages, blank pages, and on the top of one side, write fire, and on the other side, write compost. And during every section, or every day, because when we taught in person, we would go for 12 to 14 days, and every day or half day would be a different subject. And under the fire side and the compost side at the end of that subject, to write all the things that fired you up about a certain subject. So let's say we're talking about water. So maybe water assessment was really exciting, and maybe dams were really exciting, but rainwater or filtration wasn't that exciting. So that went into the compost list. And the idea is we compost our limitation and our scars, and that comes back as fertile material for other elements that we're working on. And what would happen is by the end of a PDC, a student would have the entirety of the PDC listed out into fire and compost. And then we had another exercise to go through with students at the end. So if folks want to take this on as an exercise over this course, I'll go back to this on our final 10th office hour, and I'll tell you the next step of that. So I highly recommend taking on this little exercise, fire and compost, and using it as a way to summarize and to review and debrief each of these sections. Just going to make sure there's nothing coming in the chat here. Chat question: how much time do you recommend on site per week? Yeah, great question. Winad, make sure to put that into the question doc, and when I get through my answers, I'll make sure to answer that. So one of the things that's really important to understand is that permaculture is a tool in your toolbox. It's not a religion, nor are the people in permaculture deities. And one of the major mistakes people make in permaculture is they tend to deify people within the permaculture space, and they tend to think this is the only way forward. Years ago, I used to think that, and it really limited my ability to intake new information and systems and to become a regenerative land designer. Permaculture is a tool in my toolbox, and I'm a lowercase p permaculturalist. Yes, I go to conferences and convergences, and I'm thinking about going to the International Permaculture Convergence down in Argentina at the end of November. I went to the one many years ago in Cuba. It was a beautiful time. I loved interacting with permaculture folks, but really make sure that this isn't something that becomes the end of your education, but it is a part of your education. A couple years ago, I created a documentary called Facing Fire, Building Resiliency to Wildfire. It was a 22-minute documentary that talked about our current wildfire issues within North America and what we could do about it. And as I started to learn about this, I learned about prescription fire and anthropological fire, specifically through the Cultural Fire Management Council that was located in Yurok territory in the northwestern corner of California. And I went down and I actually learned how to put good fire on the landscape. And to do that, I had to take a number of firefighting courses. And what's amazing about this is that firefighters, when they start a course, they talk about a closed mindset and an open mindset. You can either come to education with a closed mindset, I know everything, this is nothing new, or you can come with an open mindset. I'm open to learning, there's new things to learn, I'm really excited about learning. And then you add to that something that I call the growth mindset, which is not only am I open, but I'm willing to be wrong. I'm willing to take some of the things that I've learned before, know that maybe they might need to be updated or they may be outdated completely. And I'm going to learn and grow and change. And that's a really important way to take a look at this work, is to check in with yourself. Am I starting with a closed mindset, an open mindset? Or maybe I could move towards a growth mindset that failure will be a part of this. I will make mistakes. My mistakes exist before I make them. I'm going to move forward with that. That then leads us into the idea of asking for help. So there's lots of ways to ask for help. I've given you all my email, javan@allpointsdesign.ca. If you can't reach me through the Canvas system, that's primarily where you should start to reach out and ask for help. But if there is a quick question, you can send it that way. And also at the end of every single slide, we have a Q&A, and I'll go over our first couple of assignments if we have time and not too many questions, and show you exactly how each of these should be filled out. This is an important one. So years ago, I was part of a new snow sport called snow biking, and I was the marketing director for North America. This is before my time in regenerative land design. And I had the opportunity to work with one of the gentlemen who worked with Burton to create snowboarding as a part of snow sports. And he had this great way of teaching people. He said, first and foremost, you got to take care of people's limbic system. So you got to take care of their worries, their frustrations. So how do I post assignments? Will I be able to finish this? How does this work? And if you take care of their limbic system, then you have to make sure that they're having fun, or encourage them to have fun. And then, and only then, and maybe, and I loved how he put that, maybe they might learn something. So what I found over my educational career, because I also have both All Points Design as my educational, All Points Design as my design firm, and I also have Regenerative Living Online, which is my new e-course platform that's been out for about 1.5 years, and we have a ton of programs already on there and many more on the way. you need to have fun at this. You need to enjoy this. You need to play with your design site. You need to sketch things out. You need to think of it as a child in many ways. Think about it as you're 2 or 3 feet tall coming into a site, being like, what's going on here? And that type of mindset really brings you into an ecological mindset. A lot of folks come to permaculture from logical, sequence oriented professions like engineering. And yeah, permaculture has a way to go about it, but there's a deeper understanding of being within a landscape. And a former colleague of mine, unfortunately, he just recently passed, Dan Palmer, had an amazing way of working with land called the living design process. And it's something that I've adopted to really be within a landscape before I start to try to decode it. So my very first site visit with clients is just to be with them, be in the site, see what it feels like for them, see what they like about the site, and to see what I feel in a site. We are highly attuned observational instruments. And the more we try to bring our brains to a site on those first couple of visits, the less we get to actively interact with our own selves. And I'll quote Tom Brown here. He's ancestral skills, wild skills instructor out of North America. And he always used to say, what's the loudest thing in the forest? The human mind. What does it sound like? It sounds like a trash can coming down suburbia alleyways at 3 a.m. in the morning. So what we're trying to do in many of our conversations is quiet the mind and really experience a site. And that's why it's so important to be on there. So again, we're working on the designer's mind. We talked a little bit about this before. We talk about this a lot in permaculture, that the burden of design is on the designer. So one of the major criticisms of permaculture is that some permaculturalists tend to advocate for non-natives, and sometimes aggressive non-natives, sometimes called weeds. And in some situations, those plants make good sense. And in other situations, they don't. And this is where we have to be very conscientious about what we are suggesting for a site, and that burden of whatever we apply to a site rests on us. And so usually for my design, I will rely on natives first, and I'll rely on non-native second, and I'll rely on non-native aggressive plants third. Because if I introduce a plant like that into a site, I then take on that burden of design. You'll see that I keep saying ask for help and ask questions, because the more we ask questions, the more we open ourselves up and the more we understand what's going on. So I copied and pasted this office hours from a previous question here. And our final design is not on November 28th. If anybody can quickly pop onto the canvas and let me know when our 10th assignment is due, I'd love to put that in there. Because one of the things that's really important here is that you can be late on your assignments. There's no big issue about it, besides the fact that if you're more than a couple of weeks late, you may not get full feedback on that. But that final due date, whenever that is, and if somebody could find that and let me know in the chat bar, that'd be great. That final due date, all assignments are due. There is no extension on that final date. This means that if you're getting behind in class, you have a great 3-4 weeks in December and January to potentially catch up or get ahead. Highly recommend that people get ahead during that break, that time. I'm just going to check the chat. March 19th. Okay, thanks so much, Winnade. So March 19th, perfect. March 19th. So definitely get ahead during that December break. But if you're getting to the end and you're feeling crunched or something happens, life happens as it does, and you're just feeling like you won't have enough time to finish, there's a couple of options. One, you can re-enroll for the next semester and jump back in. The other is you may decide you just don't want the certificate. And you know what? That's okay. I have never been asked for my PDC certificate ever for anything I've done. So I think a little bit more, some courses or not courses, some jobs, specifically things like landscapers or ecological landscapers are asking for somebody who took a PDC. But I still haven't heard of anybody who's actually asked for this certificate. So really, this is not necessarily required. Maybe you're in a profession where you're being sponsored to be here and you need to produce it, but that's another option. Just Don't worry about getting your certificate and just knowing the information. We talked about fire and compost. I'm going to switch this around and do my intro after the design process, only because I'm kind of on the roll for things within the course. So the design process for me is a little different than the other instructors, only because I really like using an iPad because I like drawing. And I'm also really keen on GIS, Geographical Information Services and Systems. So basically, I use Google Docs to collate all my information under what's called the Keyline Scale of Permanence for all things agricultural, created by P.A. Yeomans, updated by the Agrarians under Darren Doherty. And so I use that framework, the Agrarians framework, to anchor all my information. So when I'm going throughout a site, I take a look at all of the existing climate, I take a look at the existing water, I take a look at the existing access, and then I start to design within those categories. And I have all those categories in Google Earth Pro, and that allows me to then go through these different categories and think about what I want to put in these different design systems. And the reason for this is that, again, I'm a regenerative land designer. I'm not just a permaculture designer. I found new tools and I've integrated and woven them together. So this is a course around permaculture, but I want to give you the bigger scope of how I design and what I do. And then I usually use an application on iPad called Morpholio Trace, which is only for iOS, unfortunately. I know that there's other applications like Morpholio that are on Android, be it on some of the Galaxy tablets or others, but that's the way that I do it. I started with paper, started with pencil, usually was at a 2-foot scale. Then I moved to an 11 by 14 because it was easy to carry around in the field. You do a lot of experimenting in this work, and carrying around a big clipboard that was, bigger than my body and drawing when I was in the field just didn't make sense eventually. So I went to 11 by 14 inches, and that was great. That was perfect for me. Okay, so we're doing a little backwards, but here's a little bit of an introduction about me. My name is Javan Bernakevitch. I own and operate All Points Design. That's allpointsdesign.ca and regenerativeliving.online, which is an e-course learning platform that focuses on skills to live on the planet as if we intend to stay. And I got into all of this in 2009. Before that, I had worked in marketing, like I had spoken about before. I'd worked in construction. I'd worked with my father doing renovations and exteriors from about the ages of 13 to 23. I then started to work with Alberta Parks. And in Alberta Parks, I was what's called a natural interpreter. So I would walk around telling people about flora and fauna. And they had a really interesting program that you also wrote, designed, and performed nature-based musical theater. So I would dress up in costumes, and I wrote a show called Law and Order Fungal Intent, all about a fungi called mycorrhizal that had a very bad Brooklyn accent that was trying to figure out who killed his partner, Sam Spruce Tree. And I walked through the forest interviewing and shaking down other mushrooms and dancing and singing. And that was super fun. It helped me to communicate more about flora and fauna. Worked in the school system with that for a long time, and then moved up to Edmonton. Edmonton, Alberta was in the Arctic Circle for a long time. And when I moved there, I moved in the winter, and it was a minus 53 day without the wind chill Celsius. If any of you people into Fahrenheit want to convert it, that's cold. And then I started working for a company called Riverwatch, which we were taking kids down the North Saskatchewan River waterway, and we were doing water quality testing and teaching them about the river. I just realized I wasn't having the impact I wanted, and finally decided it was time to change. And because I'd worked in construction, I'd learned about a natural building program. So working with clay, sand, stone, straw, cob, went out to One United Resource Eco Village over on Vancouver Island, took a natural building apprenticeship for 6 weeks. And then at the end of it, they said, hey, do you want to take this thing called the permaculture design course? And years before, when I was living in Edmonton, I had a friend of the roommates I had come in and stay for a weekend. And they were really into permaculture, and they stayed for almost three months. And so in my mind, I was like, no, I don't need to take a course in mooching, because in my mind, I thought permaculture was mooching. But then somebody said, well, it's half price. And I was born and raised in Alberta. And if you know anything about Alberta as a province, it's kind of like Texas and Montana had a one-night stand. It's sort of this bigger, better buck and lone rugged woodsman, always looking for a good deal. I was like, sure, I'll take it. And I remember that very first day being educated by Jan Steinman and Brandon Bauer. And I remember when I was introduced to the permaculture prime principle, prime directive, which is to take responsibility for ourselves and for that of our children. And I remember hearing the ethics, care of the planet, care of the people, and then limits to consumption and redistribution of surplus, which is the original third ethic, which has changed and grown throughout the world. And then I heard David Holmgren's 12 principles, and I was blown away by the inclusiveness of this ethical set of design imperatives. And I remember raising my hand, kind of shaking. And later I learned that the Quakers, who are great in consensus making, would only speak when they quaked. This was one of the things about them. It was always about really being conscientious about when you were going to speak, because our words matter, which is not generally how we think about words these days. And I remember raising my hand and going, this is the closest thing I can think to a life ethic that I could live on. And later that night in my journal, I wrote, I'd rather fail at permaculture than succeed at pretty much everything else. And then I jumped in hands and feet, as my Cuban permaculture compatriots would say. I luckily got signed on to a job creation partnership with the province of British Columbia. And I was basically a permaculture designer from day one. It was a very rare opportunity. We were designing gardens, putting in ponds, doing all of that amazing work. And then I started to reach out and started to create a lot of great connections in this permaculture space. And it was one of the things that produced more opportunity than anything else. I reached out to make conversations, and I highly recommend you do that with your classmates and other people you interact with. And I realized there wasn't anybody in British Columbia that was creating an educational company that would bring in instructors so that way people could learn. So I made Permaculture British Columbia, or permaculturebc.com. And I started to bring in instructors. And this was great because this was like my bachelor's of permaculture. I brought in people, I learned from them. They produced courses. I made a little bit of money, emphasis on little. And then I started to get designs. I started to get people interested in the work that I was doing. And one of the things I did right off the bat, which was very useful, is that any money I brought in, I had mentors that I turned around and paid and said, hey, walk me through this design, because I was so new. And it was wonderful because I got to borrow their brain and they worked on the project with me. And as I got bigger and bigger projects, I took on more and more of that design work and layout and all the rest of it. And as I started to become more known, I started to put on permaculture design courses, and I hosted them first and taught very little because I didn't know anything. I wasn't capable. So I hired instructors and they would come in and teach. And then as I learned and grew, I taught more and more and more of it. And at that point, I started getting invitations to go and teach at other PDCs. So I got an invitation to go and teach with Ron Berezan, the urban farmer, down in Cuba. And we had this 21-day-long permaculture design course where we started in Veradero and we went to Sancto Spiritus and we ended up in Santiago de Cuba. And we got to design and build on these amazing Cubano farms and do these wonderful designs for people that were just so involved in the movement. Cuba is very, very invested in permaculture due to the special period where the US embargo basically cut imports to Cuba overnight. And it's called the special period because what else could you call a time when the majority of the populace lost 20 kilos in personal weight? And they had to figure out different ways of growing. And so a number of permaculturists came from Australia to teach permaculture and organic agriculture. And to this day, they still use a lot of that work. And last time I was in Cuba a couple of years ago, 75% of the fruits and veg that were consumed in Havana were produced in and around Havana. So it's an amazing approach, an amazing application of what can happen with permaculture. Then I got invited to go to Kenya, and I worked in Kenya and Uganda, creating the Practical Permaculture Institute of Kenya, which now has the Practical Permaculture Institutes of Africa, with Michael Nichols of Seven Ravens Permaculture Farm and Academy, and was able to introduce a lot of water design processes that I had perfected over in Canada and from different mentors. And then I started getting larger and larger designs to the point where last year I was invited to design a 6,500 hectare farm in Uganda, and still get invitations to design the world over today. Up until about a month ago, I was based in Canada, and my family was looking for a change. And they really wanted to move somewhere warm. My husband doesn't deal well with the cold. And so we looked in Central America, and we looked in Northern South America, and found Ecuador. And so I moved to Ecuador a month ago. And so I'm just reacquainting myself with tropical systems, because I've worked in tropical systems in Cuba and Kenya again, and we'll probably be here for a year. And so I'll be reapplying everything I know about, refreshing, not reapplying, but refreshing. And so very interesting to be on the equator, because it's a very different climate. And I was just walking through the garden today, and, to see a peach tree that's in bloom with fresh flowers, but also has full fruit and leaves and no leaves, is very interesting, because of course that's not something that's very used to me, coming from cold, temperate Canada, where it was normally minus 25, minus 30 Celsius, and we had very specific systems. So last thing is, a couple of years ago, I noticed that there was a lot of polarization in the permaculture space. And I think it had a lot to do with the polarization in politics in North America and COVID and everything else. And I really just wanted a digital space that wasn't married to any one ideology. And so I reached out to a really good friend of mine and said, hey, do you want to offer a living soils course? Because Joe Tobias of Root Shoot had been doing amazing work under the work of the Living Soil Food Web under Elaine Ingham, Dr. Elaine Ingham. And so we offered this amazing course called Working and Understanding and Applying Living Soils. We sold out. We had a great course. And then I reached out to a really good friend and colleague of mine, Kakasimu Isquith, who's a Métis Cree woman north of Edmonton, who's been canning and growing all of her own food for over 6 years for a family of 5. And so we created Family Food Security, which is an amazing course if you're new to food growing, because we don't really cover food growing in permaculture design, because it's about the design course. But any question you want, ask away, and I'll answer, to be sure. And so since then, we've produced almost 14 different courses. We have another 14 to go. We've got a composting toilets course that starts on Thursday. We've got a coppice agroforestry course that starts in January, a gray water course that starts in January, and then a rainwater harvesting course that happens a few months later. And then we have a number of other courses that are in the works, grazing with goats. Mark Lakeman and I are talking about placemaking. If you haven't looked up Mark Lakeman and the City Repair Project in Portland, Oregon, there's content in this course about it. But this is just another extension of my love of pedagogy and sharing that. And then finally, years ago, I started looking into holistic management created by Alan Savory. And part of holistic management was holistic decision-making, which really changed my way of looking at the world. So much of our world is about having something. And then if we have something, we think at some point we'll eventually be something. And yet the world doesn't work that way. Usually if we have a sense of what we want to be true from a quality of life perspective, then we can evaluate any decision for its ability to bring us there. And I'll give you an example. So there's this movie, this documentary that came out a little while ago called The Biggest Little Farm. And it was about, I think, a nutritionalist and a filmmaker who decided they had enough of Los Angeles and they wanted to have a farm. They got an angel investor that helped to pay for it all, which is important because they kind of gloss over that. A lot of people watch that film and think, oh, I can make a permaculture farm that quickly with not the same financial resources, which is important to make a note of. And what was interesting is after that film came out, I got a lot of calls saying, hey, I saw the Biggest Little Farm and I saw you do design and I like your work and your portfolio. I want that. And part of my work within holistic decision-making and values-based decision-making is to ask people, well, why? Why do you want that? And when you really get down to people's why, to their values, their quality of life they're looking for, a lot of those elements are things like, well, I want to know where my food comes from. And I want my kids to grow up with clean food and clean air and clean drinking water. And I want time, I want to live well. And when you look at all those things, for anybody who's ever farmed before, a lot of those quality of lives are eaten up by farming. Farming's hard. It takes a lot of time, takes a lot of work, takes a lot of effort. And so one of the things that values-based decision-making does is it really says, well, what do we want this to be and look like in the future? And then use those quality of lives, those values as filters for everything that comes next. And so as I started to specialize in this and offer this, I became known for doing this type of work. And that led me into a whole world of life design, helping people to be very clear about what they want and how to get there, helping people to change careers and become designers or become soil food web consultants or become eco-village designers, or just change and switch and grow and work with limiting beliefs. So that became a whole other side of my business that was really exciting to me because it helped to kind of round out the corners. And so now I do all of this work. I've got life design, I do land design, I do education, and it's been really exciting work for me and has really allowed me to stay active. And for the longest time, I thought I could be employable because I've been independently employed for so long. And a good colleague and friend of mine worked with Lush Cosmetics as a sustainable advisor and designer. And he would go to some of the producers for some of the cosmetic ingredients, and he would go to improve the sustainable regenerative nature of those farms. Unfortunately, he passed away, and I thought, okay, well, I'm going to go and apply for a job. It's my first time in, I don't know, 20 years. And I remember them saying, well, you have to be in the office every single day. And you have to do all of these things that seemed like make work projects. And I was just realizing that I was totally unemployable. I'd been working on my own for so long and working with values-based decision-making and working with all of these processes that it was very, very, very apparent to me that as Bill Mollison used to say, and now Jeff Lawton says, that everything gardens. And it's very weird for us to be employed by other people when you take a look at the ecological principles that design our world. There are so many things in human existence that really don't follow with ecological principles. So it became very, very important to me to live my life ecologically on all ways, in all ways, shapes, and forms. So that's a little bit about that life design. And we'll be hosting a group online course about values-based decision-making in January, February 2023. So if people are interested about that, feel free to reach out. I'm just going to check the chat here. Oh, great. Yeah, Deb's reaching out, talking a little bit about a few connections. So I'll get back to that in a second there, Deb. Okay, lovely. Okay, so I don't see any questions in the question doc, but I did see a question or two here. So I'm just gonna pop these over into the question doc because we do want to make sure that we always have them here, and I won't make a habit of doing this. So please do make sure that you put your questions into the question doc. Oop, I put in Daniel twice. Leonard. Okay, cool. So Daniel has a question here. As this session goes through the winter months, are there tasks that could be difficult to accomplish in the winter months for those in northern climates, such as the soil jar test? And do we need to do before the snow flies? If so, where will one find the information to do the test? Great question. So I think I talked about that a little bit when we started. So yeah, there's a number of assignments. And so I'd recommend if anybody's in a place where it's temperate to go through the template, take a look at what's required and start to take a look at that. So we could do that now, actually. So this is the report template that I created with a group of students a couple years ago. And just take a moment to appreciate that this didn't exist for a number of years at the Oregon State PDC. So this is a pretty fantastic tool we have here, to the point to where a lot of my colleagues now use this as their professional design template because it has everything. So I don't want to introduce this just yet. I just want to quickly scroll through and answer Daniel's question. So definitely the design site, there's photos here you have to take of a site, and that's due next week. So that's important. Base map, if you need to go and measure distances to elements and put that into your base map, so that could be useful. Client interview, sometimes you'll need to go on site and inventory what's there, so that could be useful. Site and regional challenges, usually that's mostly a research-based thing, but you could be on site to take a look at that. Sector compass, you'll need to be on site. Microclimates, you'll need to be on site. Current zones, if your potential client doesn't know the pathways, you may want to visually take a look and see what they look like. And a lot of these assignments you'll see, especially if you're in a temperate zone, you can make a winter and a summer. So you could make a winter and summer microclimate, winter, summer zones. Water survey, yeah, a little. You'd want to know some few things, but you can usually know that. If you need to understand sizing of different areas, soil map and test, yeah, you'll want to take your soil jar tests and your percolation holes and all that, and your observations early. Local ecology, site cross-section you'll need to measure, so you may want to take measurements early. Local plant survey especially. So, identifying plants, once we start to lose leaves, it's very hard to identify plants. System design, not so much. Building survey, not so much. Zone 1 design, a little, but once you have that previous information, you're good. Local network survey and concept plan. Yeah, so I would say those are the ones that I would work on there. Daniel, great question. Just going to take a look at the chat. Corey, please put your question into the question doc. We're just gonna make a hard line and make sure people start putting that into the question doc.
I think I was waiting for access to it.
Okay, I've posted it a few times there, and it's also on our
It says request edit access, and I press that button.
So if you click on that, what happens?
It says
I keep putting it on as viewer. Thank you, sir. Editor.
Yep.
There we go. Here we go, everybody. Thank you, Corey.
Yep.
Perfect. And I'll make a note to do that on our Canvas site as well. Perfect. Daniel, did that answer your question? Is there anything else to add there, sir?
Let's see.
Okay, yes, perfect. Great. And I'll just get everybody else to mute yourselves. Winard, how much time do you recommend on site per week? Yeah, that really depends. It depends on how long it takes you to make those observations. I like when I'm designing to see a site at least once or twice every season. So my design process is a lot longer than most people's. I tend to take a full year on a design site because I like to see it in the spring, the summer, the fall, and the winter. So I tend to take a much longer time and a much longer viewpoint. My designs tend to be a lot more involved though, and have a little bit more durability, so to speak. So I take a little bit more time, but I could imagine an hour or two at minimum over the next 20 weeks would be great. But great question. Great. So we've got the Woder, we've got that link. Hopefully that's working for folks. Okay. So I'm just going to wait for people to put their questions. And so questions will go right here. Whoever's totally highlighted, still not letting me put it in. Okay, let me try one more time here. Editor, copy link. Okay, so I'm going to put this in here now. If somebody could check that out, please. Oh, looks like anonymous Kraken is. Yeah, I can edit. Perfect. So yeah, so just make sure to put your question there. We'll come back to this in a second. So I'm going to go over our first assignments here. Sorry? Okay, so we're going to go back to our template. So quick introduction. I've done all the tutorials as well, so it's a little bit review, but we've got all of our video tutorials about how to work the Google Slides and how to work the template above. And so basically you just start in the top left-hand corner, go down column 1, start in column 2, start at the top and go down column 2. Everything here is specific, and one of the main things that people sometimes miss is how to edit this insert your name, project name, and that's this tutorial right here. Anything in blue is going to be advice or elements to remember, and anything in yellow is what you have to change in your design slide. On the top right-hand corner, we have previous student examples, which is a master list that I've developed, just developed this past course. And so these are all the students who gave their permission to share their design. So this may be something you want to do because you'll see how important this is. So if you click on any of their last names, you'll go to a copy of their design example, their portfolio, and you can take a look at their example and what they did and how it worked. And you'll see that we've got the name, we've got the scope. So if you're suburban, rural, etc., the country, state and province and city, if the design was digital or drawn or hybrid, and then highlights. So for Kevin Gu, great water features. They used a drawing program that wasn't Google Slides, and they embedded that, and they used Photoshop. For David Schumas, gravel lot, good use of slides. It was an urban design, actually really great design. When I'm capitalizing, really liking elements here. So, Ali Zachmin had an amazing design. Javan in Germany was incredibly detailed. So I just make my little notes here as I go along. So this is a great example to use. And then there's some specific examples for different areas that I've pulled out, but I think more and more I'll be leveraging this design piece. One thing that's really important is if you have used metric as a measuring system your entire life, or if you've used imperial your entire life, don't switch for this course. Just use what you use and use one of the two measuring systems for your entire course and your portfolio. Personal survey is pretty straightforward. So photo, age, occupation, things of that nature. One of the things that's important to understand is what level of interaction do you want to be in this course? If you want to be a master completing all assignments, I might point out things that you can do better, and expectations of this course, keeping in mind that it takes a long time to be good at design. Design site and land history is important to understand who were the traditional peoples who managed this landscape. So for those of you in Europe and in Africa, that could be some of your ancestors. You might have direct connection to those people. For individuals in colonized lands, it may be a different subset of people. So in this assignment, we're really asking who was originally here and what was their way of working the land and interacting, because we can learn quite a bit about them. We're going to put a few photos in here, just getting a sense of where you are in the world. We're going to get a sense of the different areas and the different cities around. And then here we get a sense of Google Earth photo or an aerial or ortho mosaic photo. And then a couple of images on site. You'll notice that the view corridor here is done by a triangle. You'd be sitting here at 19 and taking a photo out, and this kind of shows you the boundary of what that photo looks like. And then that triangle is colored, and then you color the area, or pardon me, the border of that image, and it really helps to establish it. This is our first Q&A. So this is a question directly to me. So if you have a question about your assignment or how you did it, or if you would add more or what I think about it, this is a great place to put in a question, which I'll answer in our video feedback. If you don't use this slide, please delete this slide. You don't need to keep it. The other thing we do for each and every one of our assignments is a SWOT analysis: strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And I go over it in the tutorial, but something that's important to note is some people get a little tired because their SWOT analysis, if you're doing it right, will become repetitious. It's like you see the same weaknesses over and over. That's really important in design because we want to come at something over and over from the same angle, or pardon me, different angles, and potentially producing the same result of, oh yeah, this is a problem. I do need to design around this in my site. Or you might come to budget. There's just no money to do this. Okay, well then there's not much you can do on this site, or you may have to think creatively about how to fund it. So sometimes those SWOT analysis can be the same. And then again, here we got climate survey. So this is a great opportunity to get a sense of different elements. If you're in the US, put in the USD hardiness zone. If you're in Canada, put the Canada zone. If you're in Europe or you're using the international zones, put those in and then delete the ones you're not using. Köppen-Geiger is recommended, but not required. But as you start to work internationally, you'll find that the Köppen-Geiger climate classifications are fantastic to use. And we even have an advanced climate resiliency course that leverages that. So it'd be good to get used to them. You may find that you have this type of data as just a chart from something like WeatherSpark or Metro Blue or even Wikipedia. Great. You don't have to transfer the numbers. You can just copy and paste that whole chart in there. Anything that's easy. If it makes it easy, go for it. Remember that everything needs to be sourced. This is really important. You need to put in the full URL plus the access month, date, and year. So you can't just put a link. The reason for this is that we've made this template so that you could print this off, and we need to make sure that you actually have the full information there. And then we've got similar elements behind that as well. So that's an introduction to the first couple assignments. I'm noticing that there's a chat, so I'm just going to go back there. Okay, and I'm going to go back to our Q&A here. So a couple of folks saying that they can't edit the doc. So I'm not sure what that's about, but I'll work on that a little bit after the fact. So I'm going to copy Corey's question and put it in here. Oh. So I'm just going to bring up Corey's question again and pop it over into the Q&A. And then it seems like Walter has it as well.
Sorry, I feel kind of goofy. I actually posted it up above where it says ask a question.
Oh, okay. No worries.
Sorry.
All good, all good.
So on this.
We're all just learning. It just takes time. It's all good. Just okay. So it sounds like everybody's getting access now. So I'm still considering the scope of the site. It's a dune top with many disjointed spaces around an acre with a house and several slope. I don't want to overwhelm myself or the class. Any advice? Okay, so let's take a look here and see what you've put in already. So here's the design site. And so your question is, you feel it's disjointed. So are you worried it's too big? Is that the question?
Well, you know, I started putting all the pictures in, and you can go down and look at that. And, you know, it's sort of a mature oak forest that has a ton of overgrowth. I mean, I feel part of it is, you know, it's a little bit difficult to describe. I mean, I feel like I probably need 4 or 5 more slides. And I just don't want to overwhelm myself or the class. So it just kind of like asking general advice. If you think a site like this is manageable.
Yeah. Good question. So this is a great point, and I'm glad you brought it up because I think this will be important for everybody. Generally starting off, especially when you're just starting brand new on permaculture, I would pick a smaller area as opposed to a larger area to design. So in this situation, you've got main residence, artist in residence, abandoned cabin, mechanical lift, a number of different elements here. So what I might do is prioritize what's really important about this site. So it may be that water is really important on the site, and you really just want to focus on the water layer for everything. And so if you just wanted to focus on one layer for the entire site, that would be fine. Or let's say you want to really focus on the area just around that main residence. So usually what we'll do is we'll create an entire base map for everything, but then this will be our design site, and this is what we'll focus upon. So I would say, yeah, focus it down and choose an area that's really important to you, so that way you can focus on learning the process of permaculture and not being overwhelmed on the design site. Does that answer your question, Corey?
Yeah, it does. I mean, I guess, you know, I know the spaces, if I could figure out how they all relate to each other in the long term, that's, you know, going to be the best. But I also think, you know, if I design one slope and think about water management on one slope, that will apply to other spaces. I guess sort of my where I'm at is that I'd kind of like to do a flat space at the top in conjunction with the one slope, because then you kind of get the both of them.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you.
Yeah, most welcome. Thanks so much for the question. Okay, and I think we got one more from Woder. I can't edit the doc, so I'll ask the question here. Is there any leeway for late submission if you are away at some point during the course? For example, you may not be able to comment on other people's work during that time. Yeah, so you can definitely submit late. The only requirement or the only issue is you may not get full feedback. So yeah, there's definitely leeway for that. I have about a 28 acre site. Would you recommend I focus on a site I have started to work on already, or would I go for the greenfield area of the property? I don't know if this is also Woder or if this is somebody else. Yeah, I would say whatever feels like you have the ability to complete. And basically, if it feels like it's overwhelming, chances are you'll want to focus in on one area. So if it feels like, wow, 28 acres is a huge amount of space to think about, then yeah, I would just focus on one area. And if it's a green field of the area or around the main house, yeah, I would absolutely focus on a smaller area. Does that help, Deb?
Yes.
Okay, great. Awesome. All right. So it doesn't look, oh, we might have one last question trying to squeeze in here. So Ben, I've started developing an idle farm, family farm back in November 2020 and plan to use it as my design for the course. I already have a couple of improvements to the site, applying some principles of permaculture I learned from online, mostly YouTube. Can I proceed with the site? Would you recommend I start? No. Definitely work with what you already got. No problems. Yeah, that's totally fine. Doesn't have to be brand new. In fact, sometimes the most educational work I've done is working with something pre-existing, because it's a lot of cognitive work and experiential work to try and integrate things together. So great point. Woder, with regard to the history of the site we're working on, if there's limited information about the area, then will that count against us for the assignment? No, not at all. Just means that you have less to work with. So you'll find, especially in different areas, that sometimes the information doesn't exist. And in North America, we are definitely flush with online information, especially America. So the USA has the NRCS. It has a number of LiDAR assets that we don't even have in Canada. And definitely as you get into Central America, South America, Middle East, some places in Europe, definitely in Asia, you just don't have the same resources. So sometimes we don't have that information. And so without exception, if you can't find something, you just can't find it, just put a note on your assignment, usually in red, looked high and low, couldn't find this, we'll come back to it. And that's part of it. Sometimes we don't find that information and the client has to start to build that embedded information into the work that they do. So wonderful questions, Woder, and hopefully that's helpful. All right, folks, it's been a heck of a good hour. I appreciate seeing all your fantastic faces and thanks for all your great questions. I'll leave you with this. Just really try to hold this course lightly. People can get wrapped up in this course about this thing's not working, this isn't happening, I'm frustrated. And it doesn't need to be that way. Reach out whenever you have a problem. I'm happy to answer direct. Sometimes we jump on a one-on-one Zoom and we have a quick chat on 20 minutes of Zoom and we solve all the issues. Sometimes my answer shows you that the answer was right in front of you the whole time. That's okay too. There's a lot of things going on in this course. There's a lot of back and forth. And so just be aware that there's a lot to manage and a lot to work on. And it takes time. It takes time to learn all of that. So be kind to yourselves, be kind to each other. And I really look forward to seeing all of your work. That's it. We're finished our hour in good time. And I'm looking forward to seeing you on the other office hours. Hope everyone takes care. Take and have a good time, and we'll see you soon. All right, folks. Bye now. Oh,
Bye.
you're so welcome, Mary. Oh, thanks. Thanks, Deb.